of all the times, this is probably the one I'm a little bit more nervous on because you actually have politicians in there that don't seem to give a crap. They just want to make their statement. And I think that's a little bit new. It seems like every cycle for politicians, we get some new kind of people involved where whether they're on the Republican side or the Democrat side, they definitely are like, listen, this is the way it's going to be. I'm not going to budge on my side and screw everything, right? And so I think this time you want to be a little bit more careful. For me, the way I'm looking to trade it, for instance, would be to kind of towards mid-month, and she talked about June 1st. So mid-month, if the VIX is still low, I'm going to accumulate a little VIX because that's the volatility maker. I think you'll see investors start to buy protection by buying the VIX in the second half of the month if no deal is done. So I think as long as it's low and it hasn't rallied up significantly, that would be a nice, interesting trade going into potential worry in the markets.
Despite a small midweek growth spurt on news that the U.S. Department of Labor's inflation readings were lower than expected, Bitcoin, BTC, and Ethereum, ETH, entered the weekend with moderate losses over the last 7 days. Bitcoin is down 7.9% and trades for $26,817. Even the news that the Principality of Liechtenstein will soon accept it as payment for state services could not stop the biggest cryptocurrency by market capitalization from posting a larger loss than Ethereum this week. Bitcoin has had to compete with a rising dollar this week. The cryptocurrency typically has an inverse relationship with the dollar, so the latter's rise over the last 2 days has manifested in a pullback in Bitcoin's value. Hello and welcome to Money Talks. In today's video, founder and chief market strategist at InTheMoneyStocks.com and verified crypto investing, Gareth Soloway updates his view on the Fed raising interest rate and what's the effect on Bitcoin in the current market standing, and his outlook for Bitcoin in 2023.
It is kind of a joke, right? I mean, it's to have this debt ceiling that has to be budged every X amount of months or years, but then you always raise it anyways, and it doesn't really end up mattering. So I agree with you. I think it's more like if you're going to ask foreign countries to finance us, just like, if I'm running my household and I'm like spending money left and right, not paying off my bills, the bank's probably not going to give me a loan. So I think there's something to that where as long as they say, okay, we can only spend X amount before the next time we have to vote on it, maybe it coerces these foreign governments to give us more money. It's ridiculous, though. At this point, it is absolutely ludicrous. You mentioned before the Social Security Medicare side where the government may not be able to pay people Social Security. That pisses me off even more, right? And the reason that pisses me off even more is that people paid that money in. That's actually their money, right? If you're getting Social Security, you paid your entire career into Social Security. So it's one thing to say, okay, well, we don't have enough money to pay this or that, but freaking give people their money back, right? I mean, and so I don't know. You get me off on these tangents and then I start losing my mind.
On Monday, American crypto exchange Bittrex filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The news comes weeks after the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, charged the company with failing to register as a broker-dealer, exchange, and clearing agency, and said the agency netted at least $1.3 billion in illicit revenue between 2017 and 2022. Back in March, Bittrex said it was winding down U.S. operations, with CEO Richie Lai citing the current U.S. regulatory and economic environment as reasons for the decision. At a hearing in Washington on Wednesday, Republican and Democrat lawmakers failed to find common ground over the extent to which new regulation is needed for digital assets. Their main difficulty is deciding whether a token should be considered a security or commodity. If the former, then regulatory jurisdiction would be given to the SEC. If the latter, it would go to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC. That same day, Texas lawmakers voted overwhelmingly in favor of an update to the state's Bill of Rights to include the right of the people to own, hold, and use digital currencies. It's still a long way from being passed, though, and still has to pass one more vote in the House, one in the Senate, and a people's vote.
And which, by the way, is just one more reason why there's long-term viability for Bitcoin, right? I mean, for cryptos in general. I mean, again, not necessarily the cryptos that can continue to expand exponentially that don't have the non-fiat aspect to them, but I mean, shit, if we look at what happened with the banking crises recently and how that just proved to us why we need Bitcoin, Well, guess what? Here's another example. I mean, you got a government that inevitably will raise, and then they owe X amount to Social Security, which is they owe us our money. They're going to have to print that at some point. I mean, there's just endless printing that will go on. But I think investors also need to recognize that that's a long-term issue. It's not something that, like, I'm not going to buy Bitcoin today because all of a sudden
Exactly. That's how I feel.
what I do worry is that this is one of those like pre-tremors before a bigger earthquake. Like, the Fed has raised rates so quickly in this situation, we started to see things break in the banking system. At some point, something in the economy is going to break, and we are going to go into a recession. And my biggest fear is that the Fed, because inflation is still elevated, they're not going to be able to come to the rescue like they did in 2018, like they did in 2009 with easy money policy. And so where does that put us? Does that put us in a long bear market? Does it put us in a long-term recession where literally we could be in a recession for 2 years, 3 years before we're able to get out of it? And the question then is, how bad do balance sheet look for stocks? Like, for me, I look at a stock like Apple trading at a forward PE of 27, and I understand it's a safety hedge right now, but if we get in a recession, how do you justify that price to earnings? I can't personally. It's ludicrous.
Finally, on Thursday, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce slammed the SEC for its regulation by enforcement approach toward the digital asset industry. It filed an amicus brief in support of Coinbase in the exchange's ongoing court petition to get the securities regulator to clarify its rules. The SEC has deliberately muddied the waters by claiming sweeping authority over digital assets while deploying a haphazard enforcement-based approach, the chamber wrote. This regulatory chaos is by design, not happenstance.
I mean, the only thing that kind of made me think that they were going to pause is, number one, Jerome Powell kind of alluded to that, and he doesn't like to surprise the market. So if you look at the Fed funds futures and what they're pricing in, they are pricing in pretty heavily a pause next month. So that leads me to believe that the Fed won't want to surprise things unless the economic data gets really out of control. The other thing to keep in mind with the non-farm payrolls on Friday, the Federal Reserve had those numbers, or at least the approximate numbers, on Wednesday when they made that decision, and he gave those commentary. They always get the numbers a little bit ahead of everyone else. So I do think, taking that into account, he probably was aware. And I also think that if you look at some of the underlying factors in the non-farm payrolls, there were some signs that there were some weakening trends. Not in the headline numbers yet, but there were a few little signals. So, the other question too is the Fed has to be aware. I mean, this is what drove me nuts about that. I mean, Jerome Powell stood in front of everyone and said, hey, the banking system's stronger, it's doing fine.
I was going to get to that,
yep. And then the banks collapsed, literally 50% down for Pac West and some of these other ones. And so the Fed has to be acutely aware that every time they raise 25 basis points here on out, you're basically putting another knife in the back of the regional banks. And so there's going to be a point where he's going to cause more catastrophic impacts. And the question is he ready to deal with that? And I don't know, man. I don't trust the Fed here. I think they're totally out of their comfort zone.
So, what are your thoughts about Gareth Soloway's prediction? Tell us in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon with the next video. Thank you so much for watching.